other than that, I'd like to welcome Diane English first. Diane, are you on the call?
I'm here.
Perfect. Welcome, Diane, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. And I see that a couple of people are having issues with the audio, and Jennifer can address that by just helping you through the chat box. So again, everyone, thanks so much for joining. I know we are very, very close to implementation of the new pool regulations, and you've probably all been working hard to come up to speed with them. So we're going to give you a high-level overview today of some of the most important changes. We'll talk about the history of how we got here and how quickly we got here, some of the vital information you need, and as well as some recommendations, and obviously have time for questions. So let's talk a bit about what some next steps might be. So here's sort of our path to how we got to today. Early in 2016, the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care announced that they would be modernizing the Health Promotion Protection Act and regulations underneath those that relate to food handling, as well as pools and other aspects of public health. They began with a stakeholder consultation, a couple of meetings, and then they issued very shortly after that a public discussion paper, which was very high level, and Pro, Life Saving Society, and Red Cross all made responses to those. Then in November 2017, they did their first official regulatory posting. So about a year later, they and that concerned at a very high level some general principles about updating the Pools Reg 565, spas, and also camps, as well as other regulations. That posting closed very, very quickly. And they did not give us, we had asked for a longer period to comment, but they in fact made it a very, very short window. And we'd asked for 60 days, but we didn't receive that. So then in January 2018, just a few months ago, they put a second posting up, and this was to address the stakeholders' call to have splash, spray pads, receiving basins, and wading pools be incorporated into the pool regulation, and we know that those are very now very popular and prevalent facilities in your communities. So that was a very short posting to allow them to incorporate that kind of a pool into the regulations. Then shortly after that, they posted the draft regulations and noted that on July 1st, just a week or so away, full implementation will come into force for the regulations. So that's 565. 428, which used to be spas, is now revoked, will be revoked, and the spas rolled into 565. And 568, also the camps, is revoked and replaced by 503.17. Just to note, I've given links to the relevant regulations at the end, and if you look at them now, it's actually really instructive because they have grayed out the parts in 565 that are new that will come into force, so it's good to see side by side those changes. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, I know it's a great sort of additional learning tool as we move through this phased implementation. So you might ask, we've got a new government, will anything change? Well, our Premier-designate will be sworn in just prior to this, and there'll be no changes to the regulations by July 1st. They simply don't have the time or the authority to do so, and generally, regulatory changes come in twice per year. They are done in January and July. So basically, these regulations were put through Cabinet Office in January for implementation in July. So again, the opportunity would come forward for them for any changes to be made about a year from now. But the new government does provide us an opportunity to advocate for changes. We will be, one summer season into implementing the new regulations, and so we may have some feedback for government, and we're continuing to work as a collective, a collaborative, the three organizations, in order to understand what the impact is. There will be an entirely new set of political staffers, a new minister, obviously a new premier. The bureaucrats, we know there will be some changes in the office just because of planned retirements, but there may be new staff there as well. So opportunities to brief a new government on what our issues are and seeking perhaps better clarity around some of the issues that we might be facing. So we'll be continuing to work as a collaborative, as I said, and also seeking input from stakeholders as we prepare to meet with government to brief them on these changes. So that's kind of the background, and so now I hand it over to Michael Shane from Life Saving Society, who's going to take us through the bulk of the technical detail today. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Diane, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to start off with really a look at the big picture here, and I think most of you realize that the regulation that was released amended the existing regulation we all know well as 565 for public swimming pools. But as most of you know now, that this now encompasses public pools, spas, splash pads and spray pads, wading pools, and receiving basins. And of course, receiving basins are those bodies of water at the bottom of water slides. So our old regulation has become a super regulation and pulled in the old spa regulation and some new pieces as well. There have been additional changes to Regulation 503, which used to be Regulation 568 for recreational camps. We'll talk about those briefly in this presentation. And at the moment, the 35 public health units across Ontario are receiving training, updating, and have been mandated, of course, to implement this new regulation effective July the 1st. They're facing many challenges in doing this, of course, and what I believe will happen is that they'll try to work very closely with owner-operators across the province of Ontario to bring this new regulation into placement. The first piece we're going to talk about is Regulation 565. It's a rather large piece of legislation now, and there's been, I would say, about 30% of the regulation has changed. A lot of it has been editorial in nature, but as you can see from this great photo, it now includes, of course, spray pads in the regulation. We're going to approach this review by sections. As you know, regulation is split up into, in this case, I think about 27 or 28 different sections in 565, pardon me. And Section 1, of course, always starts off in regulation with definitions, where we define terms. And you'll find in the new regulation some terms that have been added. Some of these have been pulled from existing regulation, the spa regulation, and some have been pulled in from other sources, which we'll talk about in a moment. Some are brand new because there are references to this new terminology in the regulation. And of course, some have been updated. A nursery, as an example, is now referred to as child care center. Recirculation term has been removed, and in its place simply circulation. And yes, there is allowance in the regulation now for French signage to be in place in our pools here in Ontario. The biggest change in Section 2, which is typically the classification of pools, and looking at the list of attendees that are here today, most of you, I think, are Class A operators, so public pool operators. The Class A hasn't changed. The Class B hasn't changed. Yes, there has been some updating and streamlining of terminology to bring it more in line with what the Ontario Building Code terminology is and what the different pieces of legislation have been brought to this one piece of regulation. But the big change here is we have a new class of public pools in Ontario called Class C. And Class Cs, of course, now are public wading pools, spray pads, receiving basins for facilities, and these have been included in this regulation. Of course, for Class C operators, and many of you operate wading pools as an example, or spray pads, You'll have to review certainly the changes that have been made in here, but I think many of you will become in the review somewhat familiar with this terminology and requirements of the Class C, because a lot have been pulled from what we all knew well as the non-regulated facilities issued by the Ministry of Health. And of course, those of you using the Life Saving Society wading pool guidelines should be somewhat familiar with the requirements now in this new piece of legislation. I think the big changes in this area certainly are, and I won't say that they're big, but the changes are some requirements for first aid kits. Supervision remains as attendants at wading pools, and there is a requirement for some signage posting for spray pads, and that has to do with the requirement for parental supervision. There is as well a requirement or a provision in the regulation for dual class operation. Now, for most of you, this won't mean much because we all run our pools as Class A pools. But for those of you operating Class B pools and decide, let's say in the summer, to extend an invitation to the general public to participate or join your facility or attend swimming lessons, you can switch classifications from B to A, provided there is sufficient notification to the ministry. You meet all the safety requirements and supervision requirements of a Class A facility, and you have to turn over your water more often as A pools are required to turn water over more quickly than Bs. The other important piece, I think, here for Class B operators switching to A is that when you switch back to B, the importance here, I think, is the education of the public coming to the pool. They may have been in attendance while lifeguards were on the deck at one point in time, and now you've switched back to a B and there are no lifeguards. There should be a provision and strategy in place to ensure these folks are educated with regards to the supervision being provided. The Section 5 deals with notification. Not a lot of change here, although the number 14 appears. Before, of course, we all had to notify the ministry, regional health units, when we were opening or reopening our pools, particularly in the summer. The provision now is that this notification must be made 14 days prior to you reopening. This gives the ministry sufficient time to schedule an inspection of the facility and ensure it is meeting standards. The other change here in Section 5 is the posting of inspections. Many of you are familiar with going to restaurants in the GTA and seeing posted on the wall or the window a result of inspection. You will now be required as pool owner operators to post inspection results somewhere in your facility. And for its guidance, the ministry suggested somewhere where the public can see it. So not likely in the staff office, but in an area where the public can see that the pool has been inspected and the results of the inspection. Many health units across Ontario will also post these results online. So the public will be able to go online much as they can with many restaurants across Ontario and check if the facility has been inspected and what the results were. A nice change in Section 7. Training is now required for pool operators. We had hoped they'd go further, but the word training is now in regulation. We'd hoped they'd go a little further and say certification, but we're quite happy to get at least training in. And so anyone operating a pool that is traditionally responsible for the management of safe water should have some training and knowledge. we have recommended that these individuals actually hold a certification. For you as owner-operators, that's easier to manage and ensure you've met a standard if you can put a card somewhere or a proof of certification somewhere and provide that to the public health inspector. And so we've recommended certainly a CPO or the Life Saving Society pool operator certification courses as proof of certification. The other area of change is here under Section 7, and it's the management of safe water. Here we have, for the first time, some upper limits defined for some of our typical water tests. So those of you who are familiar with salinity tests, remember 80 milligrams. Now we're at, or parts per million, it's now 80 to 120. pH remains the same at 7.2 to 7.8. We have had some changes here in bromine and chlorine residuals where upper limits have been suggested or required here in regulation. And the limits and ranges change based on the type of facility that you're operating, and you can see right there what those are. The other big question I get in presentations of this nature is in the area of automated controllers or automated sensing devices. There is a stipulation in the regulation that where you have automated controllers, you're still required to do the 30-minute test prior to opening to ensure the water's safe and the controller is actually reading what you're manually testing. But if you are running with automated controllers, you are, after 30 minutes, only required to record results every 4 hours. And that, I think, is an important distinction, the word record. You're not required to manually test every 4 hours, simply record the result of what the controller is displaying. If you don't have controllers, then of course you'll have to do, as most of us have been doing, record and take manual tests every 2 hours. So there is provision now in the regulation for automated sensing devices or controllers in our facilities, and most facilities are operating with these systems in place. So that should hopefully save us some time. Been certainly some discussion with regards to the recording of results and where these results can be recorded electronically and printed. That likely will satisfy the requirements of the regulation. Makeup water has been reduced. We're getting better with our filtration and management of safe water. And we've dropped the limit now from 20 to 15 liters per person. A lot of these numbers, people ask, where did they come from? A lot of research was done by the ministry. The Model Aquatic Health Code was used extensively, and in that a lot of research was done in the U.S. By the Canadian Center for Disease Control. And so a lot of the data from the Model Aquatic Health Code was used in establishing some of these limits. Going on into Section 7, for those of you operating outdoor pools, there's certainly a provision here for cyanuric stabilization to continue. And the modification has been made in the regulation with regards to the types of water tests taken. We saw from the previous slide that alkalinity is going to be taken more frequently. pH, chlorine, that's free and total, and bromine, water clarity and temperature. So some of these are new in their frequency. I think most of us have all taken these tests before, but certainly the frequency of the tests perhaps are new to some of us. As far as daily checks are concerned and records, the daily checks will continue in telephone checks and baler loads, makeup water and emergencies and breakdowns, and most of you are doing that already. And monthly checks and records must be maintained for ground fault circuit interrupters, the emergency stop button where you have one in place. And of course, there is a requirement for these records to be kept on site. That's often another question I get. These records must be available to the inspector when they walk in the door. So if they ask for last summer's water test records, they have to be provided on site. And so provision for that must be made now. Electronic is fine if you can access them immediately, but an inspector may want to compare results and want access to that quickly. I think from here, Gail is speaking.
Hello. Thank you for joining, everyone. I'm going to continue on to the end here, and we will entertain some questions at the end. So I'm going to be talking about the certification pieces in the regulations. And we start with lifeguard certifications. Lifeguard and assistant lifeguard now being 16 years of age, and the holder of a lifeguard or assistant certification from the Life Saving Society or Canadian Red Cross at this time. So Ministry of Health will also be posting the lifeguard standard. So Life Saving Society and ourselves, Red Cross, both worked on the competencies around this standard. So once the standard has been finalized, it will be posted on the Ministry of Health site. The other provision that is going to be allowed is granting equivalencies or adding other lifeguard certifications to the regulations. There will be a process in place to do this, and basically it will be an application process. The applications will go to Ministry of Health. They will be reviewed by a consulting agency. Has not been named, or the exact process has not been established just yet. And then the Ministry of Health will review all of the results. Standard first aid, of course, or higher. So for the lifeguard or assistant lifeguard, we are still in negotiations with regarding whether it will be a standard first aid or an emergency first aid, but the lifeguard, of course, will be a standard first aid, which is similar to what it is now. And then certificates, of course, you must have them available for your public health inspectors. They can be a hard copy, or they can be an electronic copy of the certification. So the next slide is all around the instructor certifications. And the instructor certifications have changed slightly, and that is it does remain at 16 years of age, and it has been replaced with an aquatic instructor or coach. The instructors, and I think this is the biggest change, the aquatic instructor must hold an assistant lifeguard or lifeguard certification. And if they do not, then a certified lifeguard must be on duty during that instructional period. So I think that's the most dramatic change to that one. And the other piece that's in here is clarification around the coaches, and coaches on deck need to be NCCP certified. The piece that has been removed, which was a little concern to some people, was the naming of all of the particular aquatic instructor certifications. So we're still seeking some clarification on this one from Ministry of Health. We believe that the old regulation named, for instance, the Life Saving Society Instructor Award, Canadian Red Cross, YMCA, the Instructor Ontario Teachers Certificate. So we believe that those are named, but we will be getting some more clarification on that one. I should be able to move my slide. Oops, sorry. So one thing that has been added, and I don't think this is new to anyone, As of the coroner's report in 2010, most of the facilities in Ontario have adopted the emission standards. The admission standards, children 10 and over are admitted. Children 10 and under will require supervision. So children 6 to 9 who pass a swim test can be unaccompanied. If they fail a swim test, then they need to be accompanied and directly supervised, and the ratio is stated there as 4 to 1. Children under 6 definitely need direct supervision and a 2 to 1 ratio. Signage. Little more clarification around signage. There is an allowance for photos or ideograms to be prepared for the signs as opposed to just written pool rule signs. So that's a good thing with now such cultural diversity in all of our facilities. Emergency telephone sign requires the name and address and also needs to be labeled as the emergency telephone. And they've also added 2.5 meter as the shallow or deep water designations into the regulation. Safety equipment, yes. We no longer need 20 safety pins. So the first aid supplies have been streamlined and are a little less prescriptive. So this will allow you to customize your first aid kit based on, what your incidence patterns in your pool. Maybe you need, 5,000 Band-Aids as opposed to the 20 safety pins. And operators should review thoroughly to ensure compliance and should establish their own minimum content. So that's nothing new. I mean, people stock their first aid kits on a regular basis. Now, these first aid kits referred to here are around the public consumption first aid kit as opposed to the employee or employer. So as we know, in Ontario, we follow WSIB for first aid regulations, and WSIB does state specific first aid requirements for first aid kit for the employer in regards to an employee. So Provincial Offences Act, and this is probably a big change, I believe. Public health inspectors will have the ability to issue tickets under the Provincial Offences Act with fine amounts that will vary depending on the severity of the infraction. And I'm going to skip straight to the next slide because this provides an example so that you can understand what they're talking about here. So public health inspector comes into your facility, observes the water in a Class A pool is cloudy to the extent the black disc at the deep end is not clearly visible. And it goes on to how many people are using the pool. Because this is significant safety risk for the bathers, public health inspector immediately orders the operator close the facility. They will record and issue a ticket and then set a fine. I have not actually seen the definitions of the fines. Maybe Michael can clarify that in the question period. And then, of course, the operator may plead guilty, pay the fine, plead guilty with an explanation and seek a reduced fine, plead innocent and request a trial. Recreational camps, so this has now been renamed to 503-17, and it now includes requirements for operator training, the safety plan, telephones, waterfront safety, swim tests, and most of the requirements for the camps did come from 565. So they have made the language more consistent. Waterfront safety does include some very specific parameters around the areas designated for either instruction or public swims. They also have a swim test outlined in there. The new change for certification in the recreational camps is around the waterfront supervision, and they now must be a lifeguard, which means 16 years of age with a lifeguard certification, again named from 565. This is a huge change from the previous regulation, which was bronze medallion. And there we go. Jennifer, did you want to host our questions? Uh-oh.
Gail.
Hello. Yep.
Hi. So
Hi.
Michael's doing a great job of typing away there, and Diane as well, and answering some of the questions. One of the questions, Gail, that Stacy asked earlier on, let me just scroll through and find that one again. Are they changing, I think this one's for you, Gail, are they changing the age of when people can take the Red Cross instructor's course since they cannot teach till they are 16?
So the standard in the regulation clearly states that a lifeguard to be employed and stand on deck needs to be 16, as well as the instructor. Training, which again we're still working on standards with Ministry of Health. So we are actually recommending that the training age be prior to 16, so that, of course, with staff shortages, the candidates on courses are prepared to be hired right at 16 years of age. So we will have to keep people posted on that.
Fantastic. I hope that answers things for you, Stacy. So we've got some more questions coming through, but Mike and Diane, are you both unmuted as well, just to be able to answer some of these over the phone?
Yes, I'm
indeed.
unmuted.
Okay. So Sue asked, any idea on the ratio of swimmer lifeguards in open waterfront?
The camp regulation, which is 50317, I'm just flipping to this quickly, I believe still has the old chart in it, or reference to a chart. And yeah, we still see in here a waterfront area direct camp shall ensure that supervision is provided as follows. 2 lifeguards are required from 1 to 25 campers. 3 lifeguards are required from 26 to 100, and if more than 100, 1 additional lifeguard shall be provided for each additional 25 campers.
Great. And Stacy is wondering, because there are currently 15 years for WSI, if that continues, could it be incorporated into the training programs, explaining that part of the regulations and that they cannot be employed until they turn 16 years?
Yes, that's a very good point. And that would only be in Ontario, but speaking for Canadian Red Cross, we could certainly let our water safety instructor trainers that are training the WSIs know, and they are aware that they are training before 16 and they have to wait until they are 16 to be employed. That's a very good suggestion.
Awesome, that's great. So please note that there's a lot of content right now that's coming through the chat. In addition to the recording of the webinar today too, we'll export the chat. So some of those longer responses that both Michael and Diane shared, we can do that and share that with the group afterwards as well. So Christina Thibault is asking, for those who have automatic sensing devices, are you using muriatic acid to control your pH? Is a vat of acid in a separate location from your chlorine vat? So I think this is like a group question. So, and we've got multiple people answering. Thanks, Ryan. And Stacey's just asking, can you clarify in the new camp regulations, do they only apply to overnight camps and not day camps? Good question, Stacey.
Yeah, there's a definition in the very beginning, and I was flipping back to it as well. To find the definition of recreational camp means a camp for recreational activities on a site in which sleeping and eating facilities are provided for temporary occupancy with or without charge for 5 or more persons under the age of 18. So that's the current definition that would apply.
Yeah, and that is a little up to interpretation, because I know some municipalities may run as part of a day camp an overnight camp. So I think, it might be the case in those municipalities that have those kinds of facilities, or are maybe partnering with a conservation authority. So it's always, you're always going to be erring on the side of the more stringent regulation and going above and beyond. But in terms of that training, the training pieces, I mean, if it's your municipal camp and you use it as part of your day camp, you're already going to be meeting the standard, because obviously it's running as an overnight camp at some point. But yeah, no, it's not your summer day camp per se. It would only be when overnights happen. Even though it might you might go to a place where overnights happen during a daytime.
So Sue, thanks Diane. Sue's asking, in Reg 5037, there is a note that the medical officer of health needs to be notified of any operation of a day camp. Is that correct?
Yes. There is a requirement in the regulation for this notification, and it's using the same 14-day requirement. It's in subsection 2 of the requirement in the regulation.
Fantastic. And just earlier in the chat, we did put in the URL link to the Ontario site where the current regulation documents can be found. Also, just as a note, Life Saving Society, Canadian Red Cross, and PRO is of course dedicated to continuing to support the sector with all of these changes that are coming forth shortly. And so in order to do that, we've planned to do some additional webinars in the near future. So look forward to some more opportunities to have discussions later on in the summer, once the regulations have taken into effect for a little while, and then early in the fall of this year as well. So if there's any other questions, feel free to enter them in the chat pod, and we'll see if we can get to them. Otherwise, are there any last notes from our presenters?
I would ask, it's Diane at PRO, and one of the things that we want to hear from is how it's going with the health inspectors. What are your challenges? One of the things that we did ask for was to partner with them on training and awareness, with the Ministry of Health on training and awareness, to ensure that the new regulations were well understood within the aquatic context, that the health inspectors were aware of maybe some of the challenges and how they can support support better quality and better safety. So, if there are challenges that you're facing, email us and let us know what those are. And again, that's part of our strategy to work collaboratively with the Ministry of Health to ensure that the spirit of the regulations to improve safety and to improve the quality of people's experiences in water in Ontario is maintained. So.
Well, I'll also sort of jump in here at the end, and certainly all of the questions that we've heard from owner-operators and we've discussed with the Ministry of Health and reviewed on our own and reviewing through the regulation and this is a selfish plug, by the way, have gone into the production of our new Guide to Public Pool Regulations, which came into our office yesterday. So we've already pre-sold 1,000 of these, and we're printing another couple of thousand to provide to the province, all with the intent of answering a lot of the questions that we're getting here online. Please send in your questions, because as we get more of these, we'll consider those and work further to produce and revise and update our literature.
Thank you, Michael and Diane and Gail. It was really an informative session. I think these are really important to reach out to the sector and to members and make sure that there's opportunities there. There are just a couple last questions. Leslie is just coming in with, it's clear that equipment can be shared between a pool and spa within the same area. Is the same clarification provided for 2 pools?
That's a good question. Often we get questions where pools within the same area, natatorium, where you might have a 25-meter pool or leisure pool, a wading pool, and a spa, even though there are separate requirements for each, there is provision in the regulation for avoidance of duplication. So I would have to say that given that that's written right into the regulation for that provision to be made, yes, there is going to be some allowance by your public health inspector for you not to have 3 spinal boards and 6 buoyant throwing aids if you have a number of facilities within the same structure.
Great, and I see one last from Christina. Is there any legislation or regulation indication of the distance needed between vats of acid and chlorine when using automatic sensing devices? Maybe we need to circle back maybe about that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't really understand that question with regards to the distance. Oh, I see the distance between. No, there is no provision and regulation with regards to the distance required. There has to be separation and safety to ensure these two are a safe distance and do not, there is provision so that they will not mix, but there is no provision in the regulation with regards to a distance.
Perfect. And Sherry's asking, can you please review the requirements for first aid kits and supervision at splash pads?
I'll talk about the supervision at splash pads. There is none. It's not required at splash pads.
Easy.
Because there's no water. It runs to waste. There is a provision for a sign to be posted that parents watch your children or something to that effect. Gail, do you want to talk about the first aid kit thing?
Sure. The first aid, so the first aid kit, sorry, what is the, what's the actual question there?
So can you please review the requirements for the first aid kits and at splash pads?
Oh, sorry. I'm not, Michael, maybe you could respond to that one. I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, I'm looking through this legislation.
Yeah, so am I.
This regulation.
Yeah.
So yeah, Sherry, it's in section 20, where they deal with every owner and operator of a public pool or spa. So again, it is not stipulated,
Yeah.
I don't think. But if you review section 20, and it's nicely highlighted for you.
Yeah, there is a section 26.3 in the wading pool regulation that does refer to it, and the reference is provide a first aid kit, a device for emergency communications, et cetera, but there is no specification as to its content. So I'm guessing
and that, again, that's for wading. Yeah, and that's for wading pool, not splash pad, correct, Michael?
Correct.
Correct.
Yeah, so, yeah, and there are supervision specifications in that section as well, and they, and it's, I did a kind of look around to see what municipalities are doing, and generally municipalities are exceeding what's already in the regulation.
Yep. So given that there is no requirement for spray pads, you wouldn't be required to provide a first aid kit or supervision at a spray pad.
Splash pad, no.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, I think we'll wrap it up a little bit early. Thank you so much for your time, Michael, Gail, and Diane. It's really appreciated. I know that you have put a lot of time and effort and work into this leading up to the changes, and then throughout the process, and you'll continue to support the sector, and we greatly appreciate all of the work that you've done and you continue to do. I'd like to also mention that we do have the Aquatics Conference and Trade Show coming up this fall, and there will be sessions during that conference that will be touching on certain areas of the regulation changes. So look forward to that program coming out early in the summer, and also further information on more webinars for you to take part in. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed the presentation. We will be sharing all the information as mentioned, the slides, the recording, and the chat pod. And we'll feel free to, as Diane and Michael and Gail mentioned, feel free to contact them with any of your questions directly. Their emails are there on the screen. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your week.